Marshall McLuhan, author, dies. Declared medium is the message. January 1st, 1981. Marshall McLuhan, the communication theorist who taught that the medium is the message, died yesterday in his sleep at his Toronto home, his family reported. He was 69 years old. Most people are alive in an earlier time, but you must be alive in our own time, Mr. McLuhan once said. Born in what he considered an age of information, Mr. McLuhan strove to understand and explain the electronic media, which he believed were shaping people in ways they hardly suspected. He had a penchant for aphorisms, as well as weakness for puns, and he summed up his views on the effects of media in the maxim, "The medium is the message." By this, he meant that the way we acquire information affects us more than the information itself. Mr. McLuhan believed that television, for example, has a profound impact on children, not because of what is on it, but because of what is in it. Its mosaic pattern of dots of light, its lack of detail, its motion and sound, and the fact that the light comes at the viewer, all these things make television, watching, an oral and tactile experience as well as a visual one, he said, and far more deeply involving for a child than reading a book. As for television's content, he told Fordham University students in October 1967, "The public has yet to see TV as TV. Broadcasters have no awareness of its potential. The movie people are just beginning to get a grasp on film." Mr. McLuhan contended that print, by involving only the visual sense and by presenting information in small bits, one by one, gave men the power to separate thought from feeling, and led to the fragmentation of knowledge. It enabled Western men to specialize and to mechanize, but it also led, he said, to alienation from their other senses. He believed that electronic media, by showing what was happening on the other side of the world, were creating a global electronic village in which books would become obsolete. To describe the effects of different media, Mr. McLuhan used the terms hot and cool. A hot medium was one that allows of less participation than a cool one, as a lecture makes for less participation than a seminar, and a book for less than dialogue. Telephones are cool, he said, as are television and comic books. Books are hot. A phonograph is hot, a tape recorder cool. Radio and films are relatively hot among the electronic media. Magazines are hot, but not as hot as books, and there are variations within a single medium. A dictionary, on Mr. McLuhan's scale, is very hot compared with a mystery story. Richard Nixon did not go over well on television. During the 1960 presidential campaign, Mr. McLuhan argued because he was a hot person in a cool medium. John F. Kennedy was more effective because he was cool. Despite his own choice of a hot medium, books, in which to express himself, Mr. McLuhan won a wide audience and was considered by some as an oracle of the electronic age. Others accused him of being a confused and confusing phrasemonger or an outright charlatan. Although the lanky, professorial-looking theorist was revered as a prophet and teacher in advertising circles, he did not think highly of the advertising business. "The hullabaloo Madison Avenue creates couldn't condition a mouse," he said. On the other hand, he seemed to have had a good opinion of the advertisements. "The ads are by far the best part of any magazine or newspaper," he said. "Ads are news. What is wrong with them is that they are always good news." Although sometimes criticized as an arrogant apostle of electronic media, Mr. McLuhan said he was simply trying to help people control the new media by understanding their effects. "By knowing how technology shapes our environment," he once told an interviewer, we can transcend its absolutely determining power. Far from regarding technological change as inevitable, I insist that if we understand its components, we can turn it off any time we choose. Short of turning it off, there are lots of moderate controls conceivable. Mr. McLuhan often said he did not fully comprehend his own work. "I don't pretend to understand it," he remarked. "After all, my stuff is very difficult." Nonetheless, his two major books, The Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, created a cult of McLuhanism that he did little to discourage. Mr. McLuhan was a quiet man who rarely went to movies or watched television. He was more fond of reading and talking, especially talking. His monologues and lectures tended to be an amalgam of abstractions, flashing insights and abstruse assertions. The criminal, like the artist, is a social explorer, he said in one of his lectures. Herbert Marshall McLuhan was born July 21, 1911, in Edmonton, Alberta. His father, Herbert, was a real estate and insurance salesman, and his mother, Elsie, an actress and monologuist. After the family moved to Winnipeg, Manitoba, Marshall, then 10 years old, began to tinker with radios and thought of becoming an engineer, his goal when he entered the University of Manitoba. But, he said, "I read my way out of engineering and into English literature," and he took a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1933 and a Master's the following year. He went to Britain to study literature at Cambridge University, receiving a BA in 1936 and a doctorate in 1942 for a dissertation entitled "The Place of Thomas Nashe in the Learning of His Time." Meanwhile, Mr. McLuhan had his first brush with mass culture in 1936 when he tried to teach Elizabethan rhetoric at the University of Wisconsin. "I was confronted with young Americans I was incapable of understanding," he said. "I felt an urgent need to study their popular culture in order to get through." At about that time, he joined the Roman Catholic Church and for some years preferred to teach at parochial institutions. He said later that his books were merely probes, that he did not believe in his work as he believed in Catholicism. From 1937 to 1944, he taught at St. Louis University. Returning to Canada, he taught at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario, for 2 years, moving then to St. Michael's College, the Catholic division of the University of Toronto. He was named a full professor in 1952, a year after he published The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man. The book was his first published attempt to explore the effects of mass culture on those engulfed in it. He then expressed distaste for the pressures set up around us today by the mechanical agencies of the press, radio, movies, and advertising. Undismayed by lack of recognition, Mr. McLuhan continued to shift his focus from literature to culture in general. With part of a Ford Foundation grant in the mid-50s, he founded a periodical called Explorations, in which communications was discussed. Mr. McLuhan finally won wide recognition in 1962 for The Gutenberg Galaxy, which won him the Governor General's Award for Critical Prose, Canada's highest literary prize. The book discussed the effects on Western European culture of the invention of movable type in the 15th century. Mr. McLuhan proposed that the resulting dominance of print accounted for linear development in musical and serial thinking in mathematics and sciences. As print superseded oral communication, he argued, the eye superseded the ear as the primary sensory organ. This process, he said, led to self-centeredness in man and fragmentation in society. Thought and action were separated because the act of reading slowed down reaction to what was read. It was a pause in what McLuhan called the tribalism of man. But with the 20th century electronic age, he said, man returned to certain of his tribal ways because the world had become a global village. This opinion was elaborated upon in the 1964 book Understanding Media, which contended that electronic media, especially television, had distributed and heightened sensory awareness to such a degree that previous separation of thought and action was significantly reduced. Electronic circuitry, he also said, made human behavior less isolated and more conformist. McLuhan books are not easy reading, for the author shunned sequential argument. Trying to define his thinking more clearly, Mr. McLuhan, with Quentin Fiore, produced The Medium is the Message in 1967. It was a collection of aphorisms illustrating how life was being transformed by media. The title reflected Mr. McLuhan's opinion that a medium is not something neutral, it does something to people. It takes hold of them, he continued. It massages them, it bumps them around. While he was concentrating on communications, Mr. McLuhan continued to teach literature at Toronto. In 1963, he was appointed director of the university's Center for Culture and Technology, which does research on sensory perception as related to communications. In 1966, he was named to the Albert Schweitzer Chair in Humanities at Fordham University in the Bronx. The job was to pay $100,000 financed by New York State, but the state of Attorney General ruled that New York could not put up the money because of the constitutional ban on state aid to parochial schools. The university appropriated the money for the visitor's salary. Mr. McLuhan gave his first Fordham lecture in September 1967 to 200 students who had enrolled in his course. His first discourse was termed a good show by the editor of the campus newspaper. One student was described as being in a mild state of shock. "The poor kid," a fellow student said. He tried to take notes on it like it was a normal lecture. Meanwhile, with various collaborators, Mr. McLuhan produced books on his philosophy almost every year. His face seemed unaffected by surgery in 1967 to remove a benign brain tumor. In War and Peace in the Global Village, published in 1968, he presented a collection of epigrams and pictures posing the argument that war is an involuntary quest for identity that follows every new technological age. Mr. McLuhan made a brief appearance in Woody Allen's 1977 film Annie Hall. The character played by Mr. Allen was standing in line at a movie having an argument about Mr. McLuhan's philosophy when Mr. McLuhan suddenly appeared, settled the dispute, and exited. Mr. Allen then turned to the camera to ask why real life was not like that. His other books included Counterblast, From Cliché to Archetype, Take Today, The Exclusive as Dropout, and Culture is Our Business. The book is a very special form of communication, he told a 1969 convention of the American Booksellers Association. It is unique, and it will persist. Mr. McLuhan suffered a stroke in September 1979 and was forced to retire from teaching at the end of the school year. In 1939, Mr. McLuhan married Corinne Keller, a Texan who was a drama student at the Pasadena Playhouse in California. They had 6 children: Eric, Mary, Theresa, Stephanie, Elizabeth, and Michael. The McLuhan's Toronto home was a 3-story house with a narrow front and a small lawn. Mr. McLuhan loved to read while reclining on the living room couch with 20 books from which he chose his evening fare. In New York, he rented a house in Bronxville that was also quickly overrun with books.